Well, hello there, and welcome to the Broken Hearted Bible Study for September 2020. The Broken Hearted Bible Study is a ministry of Christ Bible Church in Cranberry Township, Pennsylvania, and it is a Bible study that ministers to people who are suffering or have suffered extraordinary trials. What are extraordinary trials? Well, they're just what the name says, extraordinary trials. The types of trials that are different from what every Christian should expect to experience. Every Christian expects their parents to die. Every Christian loses a job every now and then. Those are sad events. There's nothing wrong with mourning them, and we certainly weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. But not every Christian is married to a non-believer. Not every Christian has a child die of cancer. Those things are extraordinary. And in an effort to minister to people who have suffered or are suffering in extraordinary ways, this Bible study attempts to minister to them and to read the Bible and apply it to their lives in a way that will help them to honor God and to live well through those trials that they are suffering. Now, this doesn't mean that our Bible study is closing its doors to anybody who wants to come. Certainly, anyone who wants to be a part of the Bible study is more than welcome. And you're more than welcome to share this video and to invite people to our next meeting, which will be online. However, the focus is going to be on the trials and the extraordinary nature of them. Our Bible study has sort of three guidelines, and I'll tell you what they are. The first one is that this Bible study is not a pity party. We are not gathering together to wallow in our sorrow. We're not gathering together to say, woe is us and how terrible our lives are. That's not what Christians ought to do, and it's not what we're going to do in this Bible study. This Bible study believes that the broken-hearted people in the church, the people who have suffered the extraordinary trials, they need the church. But just as importantly, the church needs the broken-hearted. The broken-hearted cannot suffer through trials without the people that God has placed around them. They cannot endure the trials that they have without the benefits and the prayers and the encouragement and all the things that come with being a part of a church. But similarly, the church cannot grow without understanding and learning from and being encouraged by the brokenhearted. It is good for people who are not suffering in an extraordinary way to see others suffer and to help them through it and to glorify God with them in it. It is also good for those who are suffering to be comforted, to be helped, to be able to teach and to learn from those who are not. And so the church needs the brokenhearted, and the brokenhearted certainly need the church. And our third guideline is that we say that if you are not growing in suffering, you are sinning in suffering. God has a purpose for suffering in our lives. He has a purpose for extraordinary trials, and that is to make us more like Christ. And so it will be our goal, it will always be our goal, to help one another become more like Christ through the suffering that God has seen fit to allow into our lives. Now, this Bible study does a lot of things. We gather together in non-COVID times to have a meal together and to fellowship together and to pray together and to share our lives with one another and all those sorts of things. And in these COVID times, we're doing our best to do all of that via virtual means. But the Bible study is not a prayer group. The Bible study is not a fellowship group, and it is certainly not a shared meal. Those things may happen, but that's not what this Bible study is about. This Bible study is first and foremost a Bible study. And the reason for that is we believe that our only hope is God. In fact, we're going to learn about that in Psalm 42 today. Our only hope is God. And where do we find what God says and what he thinks and what he believes and what he wants us to believe and what he wants us to know and how he comforts us and how he guides us? Where do we find all of those things? We find them in God's infallible word. And that is what we are going to set our minds to study. So if you'll open your Bibles to Psalm 42, we'll get started with the September 2020 Bible study. So let me begin by reading Psalm 42 in its entirety. For the choir director, a maskil of the sons of Korah. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember, and I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go along with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God, with the voice of joy and thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you in despair, O my soul? And why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him for the help of his presence. O my God, my soul is in despair within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan, and the peaks of Hermon, and from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the sound of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have rolled over me. The Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and his song will be with me in the night, a prayer to the God of my life. I will say to my God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of my enemy? As a shattering of my bones, my adversaries revile me, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? Why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my countenance and my God. Well, we can certainly see why that psalm is something that would resonate with people who are suffering. We can certainly see how God would use a psalm like this in the life of a believer who is experiencing great depression. I mean, the psalmist in this psalm is as low as they go. He is experiencing great suffering in this moment, and that suffering is born, I think, out of a longing for God and being separated by God or from God. And that is something I think that ought to resonate with every believer, that if we were to be in a position where we were not able to worship as we know we should, and we were not able to, as the psalmist implies here, enter into the presence of the Lord, that would be something that would weigh heavily on us. And in that sense, I think that almost any believer, whether they have suffered in an extraordinary way or not, can connect with what it is like to suffer in ways that are extraordinary. If we can put ourselves in a mindset of saying, what would it be like if I could not run to God when I sin for forgiveness and healing? What would it be like if I could not cast my cares on Christ? What would it be like if I did not have his word to comfort me? Then we might understand the despair and the depression and the sadness that people feel for the various trials in their lives. And I think that's a lesson for the whole church, and that we can at least picture, at least get an idea of what some people may be feeling. So let's do some house cleaning here. First of all, this psalm is the first psalm in Book 2 of the Psalms. And it's notable because this is one of the first psalms, if you're reading it through, that has an attribution to it, a maskil of the sons of Korah, that is not attributed to David. Now, I'll stop and I'll note that Charles Spurgeon believes very strongly that this actually is a song of David, and that the maskil of the sons of Korah thing is just his attributing to them or dedicating it to them or even writing it for them. Who were the sons of Korah? Well, the sons of Korah were musicians that they were of the Levite tribe in Israel, and they were musicians who would lead the worship in the temple. And so the things that we say here throughout the psalm about leading the throng and the procession of the house of God in verse 4, that would not have been an uncommon thing for the sons of Korah to do, for the musicians to do, especially during the 3 festivals every year where Jews gathered together in Jerusalem and paraded down the streets on their way to the temple to worship God, there would have been musicians and people, Levites, who were leading people into the house of God. And so I don't agree with Charles Spurgeon that this is really a Psalm of David. I just don't think that's true. I think this was written by the sons of Korah. It just fits. They would be people who would write songs. They would be people who would lead a procession. It says that is a maskil of the sons of Korah, right? And so I really don't buy that it would be something that David would write. What's a maskil? I'm probably mispronouncing that, but nonetheless, a maskil is an instructive psalm. And that's really interesting. That's something we want to pay attention to. This is not just poetry for the sake of poetry. This is poetry for the sake of instructing the reader or the singer or the person who's participating in the psalm. This is something that is supposed to train and supposed to teach the person. And so what are we being taught and what are we being trained for here? Well, we're being taught in a very obvious sense how to deal with depression. Now, many people who suffer in extraordinary ways, many broken-hearted people, have depression for one reason or another. For some folks, it is the primary reason why they are broken-hearted. For others, it is a byproduct of some other event happening. A child died, or they were abused in some way, or something along those lines. And it could be anything, really, and it has spawned up depression. I myself have suffered with depression, suffered from depression. I have struggled with it a lot of my life. And in my later life here, as I've grown in some ways closer to my Lord, my bouts with it are shorter and shorter, and the depths of it are less and less. And this was uncommon for me early in my life, my adult life at least, and in my childhood. But in my later life, this is more how it goes, is some terrible thing happens to me or to my family or to somebody I care about, and I'll be very blue for a few days. The black dog, as Winston Churchill put it, will follow me around for a few days. I used to have months and months like that. I used to have a lot of time like that. But enough about me. But this is an instructive psalm. And as I said, on the surface, it's to teach us how to deal with depression. But I think that there's another thread weaving its way through this. And I'm not the only person to pick up on it. Gerald Wilson picked up on it, and Steve Lawson picked up on it in their commentaries. And that is that this is a psalm about faith. And we have little touchstones of faith throughout this psalm, even in the lowest parts, even in the most desperate parts of the depression. We have little touchstones of faith, and as we go through, we'll talk about some of those things. One of the other little house cleaning things that we can talk about here is that we have a change, and it's a notable change, in how God is addressed in this psalm. In the first 41 psalms in Book 1, God's name is used, Yahweh. And usually if you're reading in the NASB, and I think there's a few other translations, they translate that as Lord, L-O-R-D, Lord. And that's not, in my opinion, the greatest translation. I think the name is a name. You don't call me man. You don't call me sir. You call me Jason. So I think we should call God by his name, Yahweh. But in this, Psalm 42 to Psalm 83, which is Book 2 of the Psalms, they are sometimes called the Elohistic Psalter, which means that the word Elohim, it's not really a name, it's more of a title. Elohim is used to refer to God. And what does Elohim mean? Well, Elohim simply means God. That's just the word for God. It does have roots and does have some connotations of being high and mighty and set apart, holy, those sorts of things, but those are lesser. And in some ways, Elohim and the roots of it and the different ways of talking about it, the different connotations of it, are sometimes used for kings, sometimes used for idols, sometimes used for things. They're never used for common things, though. And they're never used for everyday occasions, or they're never used for just men or people. They're always used for somebody who is a little bit on a different level than everybody else. And so the idea there is that I think in Psalm 2, they want to just simply refer to God as God, but they want to use a word for God that implies that he is exalted. And so that's something that we will come across and find out here as we continue to study the Psalms from Psalm 42 to Psalm 83. So digging into verse 1, we've talked about what a maskil is. We've talked about the sons of Korah. Let's talk about what we're doing in Psalm 42, verse 1. It says that, and this is a very famous line. I remember my mother teaching me this line when I was a child. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. What in the world does that mean? What does it mean to pant for something? Well, the word here in Hebrew, it just means long for. It's just as my soul longs for the water brooks, or as the deer longs for the water brooks, so my soul longs for you, O God. Okay? And so it's really just, and it comes out as being this very vivid and strong drive. And the word itself doesn't necessarily do that, and the translation even does less, because we don't use the word pants very often unless we're talking about trousers. But in this case, the idea, the mental image, the picture that's painted by the psalmist here of a deer panting or longing for water, that does conjure up kind of what he's trying to talk about. And especially when you consider that Israel had its very dry seasons, and it had migrating animals all throughout it because they would follow the water. Some places would have water, and sometimes some places would not have water, and other times. And so these different animals would move around, and they would long for the water. And so just like a deer will order its life to follow around the water in its homeland, so also does the psalmist long for God and order his life to follow God around and to find God wherever he may be found. That's exactly the kind of connotation that we have. As important as water is to stay alive, God is to be in this person's life. And it was interesting because you can deprive people of a lot of things. And of course, if you deprive them of air, they're going to die within a few minutes. But I found it interesting when I was reading about this, that you could deprive a person or an animal of food, and they would survive for a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. It would not be a happy few weeks, but they could survive. But they can only survive a day or two without water, maybe 3 or 4 days without water. And it is one of the most painful and excruciating deaths. And the instinct to thirst in animals and in humans is much stronger and much more vivid than the instinct to eat. So this was an accurate, a very astute comparison that the psalmist is making here. We immediately understand it, and we immediately know what it feels like to be very thirsty. So just like the deer is very thirsty for the water, so the psalmist is very thirsty for God. Now, that establishes, and that works together with verse 2, which verse 2 says, "My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" And so those things work together to establish a very firm foundation that the rest of the psalm is built on. And that is that for the believer, finding and longing for and finding our fulfillment in God is absolutely the most important thing we have. And so whatever else the psalmist may say here, whatever else he may get into about his tears being his food and how he is in despair and all the rest of this, his foundation, his starting point is that he longs for God. He wants to be with his Savior. He wants to know his God. He has to find him, just like the deer has to find the water. So, speaking of tears, my tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, "Where is your God?" And so we start to get into a little more of the context here in verse 3. And that is that there is an enemy, an adversary opposing our psalmist, saying to him, "Where is your God?" And I find it interesting that this is something that we hear of even today. In fact, it is usually done in the very same mocking tones that we see here in verse 3. There is indeed nothing new under the sun, huh, believers? There's nothing new. And so we see people in our day and age, in our time period, mock us and our faith by saying, where's your God? Where was your God when that plane crashed? Where was your God when this happened? And they will use that as a justification for saying that there is no God. And they make fun of us for believing in, the sky fairy, daddy in the clouds and all those sorts of things that are just mocking. They mock us for doing that sort of thing. But here's the thing. For the believer, the whole life, the whole point is to find God. The whole point is to be with God. For the unbeliever, the most basic and fundamental way to torment a believer is to say there is no God. Now, another thing that I think is interesting about verse 3 is that I think about my times of suffering, or times that I counseled someone or helped someone when they were suffering. And one of the things that would often happen when people got out of balance with their suffering was they allowed their circumstances, their suffering, to become bigger in their mind than God. And so instead of God ruling over their life, their suffering, their circumstances, whatever it is, they began to think that their circumstances had become too big for God. And they had changed places where God should have been exalted and higher and holy and set apart. But in this case, they were rising the circumstances and the suffering and the trials and the tribulations above God, so that it was now holy and set apart and higher and exalted. And that's typically the way that we lie to ourselves when we suffer. We typically lie to ourselves by saying this is too big for God. Typically lie to ourselves by saying I don't know how to deal with this, when we know full well how to deal with this. We cast our cares on God. But it is not the tactic of the enemy to always do that. Now, if we're doing it to ourselves, certainly the enemy is going to get out of our way and let us damage ourselves that way. But when the enemy wants to go on the attack, when the enemy wants to convince us that our suffering shows us that God is not who he says he is, it doesn't raise the circumstances above God. It keeps the circumstances where they are. It takes God and lowers him below the circumstances. It is, in the enemy's mind, it is God who moves. They are trying to take God and tear him down and say things like, where is your God? How could he let these sorts of things happening? Instead of saying, oh, no, your circumstances are really bigger than you think they are. Now, listen, brothers and sisters, sometimes bad things that are happening to us are really big. And they are an all-consuming thing. Sometimes they're life-altering, and sometimes they're life-ending in some ways. Sometimes our circumstances really do take up a large portion of our lives, and a large portion of our thinking, and a large portion of our energy and time and money and whatever else it may be. I'm not diminishing circumstances. I'm not diminishing suffering or trials or anything along those lines. But what I am saying is that God is always bigger than they are. He's always able to handle them, which is why you're always able to handle them, because you have him in your corner. As we've learned in the past, God has chosen sides, and he's chosen the side of his believers. And so the enemy doesn't have to inflate your circumstances sometimes, because they're already pretty big. All he has to do is deflate God, to lie to you that God really isn't as big as you think he is, that God really isn't as powerful as you think he is, that God really isn't as sovereign as you think he is. Where is your God? I mean, this seems pretty big. This seems like a really bad thing to have happened to you. I mean, where is he? Wasn't he here? Couldn't he have prevented this? Shouldn't he have done something? I mean, why would he give you a baby with Down syndrome? Why would he do this to you? Why would he let you get married to an unbeliever? Why would he let you go through those years of abuse? Where was he? Was he on a trip? Was he in the bathroom? Whatever. Those sorts of things start to mock you like Elijah mocked the prophets of Baal. Well, we know God is not Baal. God is God. We know there's something different about God. We know that he is indeed bigger than our suffering. And so the psalmist in verse 4, to finish up the first part here, says, "These things I remember, and I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go along with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God, with the voice of joy and thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival." And so there's a couple things that I think we want to say here, okay? And the first thing is that we see that the psalmist was involved in leading the worship. This is one of the reasons why I think this was written by the sons of Korah, and that they were involved in leading the worship, that this was a regular thing for them. And they were leading a throng and proceeding to the house of God, and just like they would do 3 times a year for the 3 different festivals, that they would do this, joy and thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival, all those sorts of things. And so that's very nice and surface level that we can acknowledge that. But I also think that there's 2 things here that we need to talk about. And the first one is that memory plays a big part in the life of a believer. I remember, and I pour out my soul within me. Now, if you go back throughout history, God had called his people, and he calls us as Christians to this very day, to remember who he is, to remember his statutes, to remember his words, to recall his faithfulness, remember his faithfulness. And so this is not just some musing of some synapse firing in the psalmist's brain where he just had a random memory. The whole reason that they had these sorts of worship was for the familiarity of it in a certain way. And sometimes that became a snare to the people who were participating in the worship. I mean, the prophets often rebuked the Israelites for doing things just out of rote tradition. They were just repeating the same words mindlessly, not really thinking about them, not really caring about them, that sort of thing. But there is something to that rote tradition. There is something to that repeated process. There is something to traditions. And so in this case, it is the remembering of how they used to be joyful in leading the Lord, or leading people to the Lord, joyful in worshiping God, joyful in being in the house of God, joyful in being in his presence. Those memories are a source of reminder about who God is and what worshiping him is like. Now, in some sense, at the present moment for this psalmist, they may be a bitter memory. It may be a source of agony or sadness because they want to get back to there. But at least in that agony and in that sadness, the psalmist knows that there's something to get back to. It knows that the present sufferings are a blip on the radar. The present sufferings that the psalmist has are a part of life. They're not all of life. So this isn't the best it's ever going to be for the psalmist. The psalmist has seen better days. It knows better days. And it knows that God is a God of joy. God is a God of faithfulness. God is a God of comfort. And so it can recall those things. Even though the psalmist is not experiencing those things right now, it can recall those things. And it can say, I know it can be better than this. This is a trial. This is a temporary thing. This is not God's best. This is not the final thing God is going to give me. God is letting me go through this for a certain time. God is letting me suffer for a reason that he has. There's a purpose in it, but this is not the end. This is just the means. And so that is, I think, one of the functions of memory. Now, of course, obviously, we can talk about other functions of memorizing verses, memorizing statutes, memorizing faithfulness, all those sorts of things. But I think at the end, it's remembering who God really is when the voices that lie to us, either within us or without us, are very, very loud because of suffering. The other thing I think we need to talk about here is that worship is intended to be a communal experience. And that there was something here. Just think about this. In every verse in this psalm where the psalmist is suffering, there's a sense of loneliness, of just being by himself, isolated, apart, missing what he had. But in every sense, when he talks about being joyful or steeling himself together to get through the suffering, there is a sense of bonding. Sometimes it's just bonding with God, but in some cases, it's bonding with those who also love God. God has made us for other people. Now, an introvert like myself may not like to hear that, but that means I got to preach that verse all the more. Because I need what God says, not what I want. But there is a tendency, I think, especially when we're brokenhearted and we're suffering and we're going through hard times, there's a tendency, I think, to want to be alone. I've seen it in people. And I think that's the wrong instinct. So the next time that we're suffering and we're going through hard times, I think we got to remember that God created us for Him, for His glory, but also created us as social creatures, people who need one another, who need the church, who need people around us to remind us of His goodness. And we ought to, in our sufferings, in our lowest moments, let people into our lives and worship beside them through tears or through joy or through whatever, but to worship God with them. And I don't just mean on Sunday morning. I mean in the nitty-gritty times at the hospital bedsides, in the funeral home, in the living room after the terrible thing has happened or while the terrible thing is happening, at the coffee shop while you're discussing whatever's going on or the hard decision or the trial. To worship God in those moments too. And while it would be very unfair to say that the collective in Christianity or with God suffocates or absorbs the individual, it is also unfair to say that the individual overtakes the collective. We need one another. The church need the brokenhearted, and the brokenhearted need the church. Okay, everyone. Well, that's it for Psalm 42 in September 2020, Brokenhearted. It was great going through the Psalms with you again. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys this weekend through our video call. If you don't have a link to that, if you would like to be a part of that, please reach out to Christ Bible Church and we'll make sure you get a link. Make sure that you are able to join in on the call. It's going to be at 2 p.m. on Saturday. And so we're looking forward to seeing everybody, looking forward to praying together, looking forward to sharing about our lives together. We do invite you to come along, and we're going to do this every month. So if you want to be a part of future meetings, or if you want to make sure that you have access to this video before the meetings or whatever the case may be, just reach out to Christ Bible Church, and we will make sure that you have access to that. Be good to each other, worship your God, serve Him, and never forget that He loves you very much.